That's very exciting. There we go. So we're looking at human and non-human approaches to the arts and how they can help transform contemporary dialogue, issues like climate change. It follows, in a way, upon ideas that our sense of humanity, the sense of the body, the sense of what it means to be human, is very elusive. Our bodies are very porous, and we're expressed in multiple forms. Through the interventions at our levels in this panel, levels of platform, system, code, sentience, and non-human critical thinking, the panel conceptualizes a point of contact between the human and non-human, and looks at this contact as a moment of art, one requiring urgent response to address issues of our time. There are 4 papers. Søren polled with platformed perception will begin the dialogue, followed by human, non-human contact, human, non-human sense and sentience, and being with others, art in search of Hollow perspective. And with that, I'd like to turn it to Søren Pold to begin the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Rod. I'll start with the quick, something that's actually a quick version of a paper that will be out in a book from the conference called Ex-Coax, and it's co-written with Christian, who's sitting in the audience. And it's about the sort of platform perception, as the title says. So with the emergence of a platform culture running on clouds, appearing as apps on computers, phones, streamers, etc., we are witnessing what in general can be described as a sort of clouded and phantasmagorical meta interface, what we call a meta interface in our book. So platform interfaces often virtualize and displace the infrastructural element and the whole machinery to create the immediately clickable, where users are not supposed to worry about the effects of their clicks. Hence this Google minimalism. Furthermore, platforms normally present individual interfaces to mass phenomena such as social media and media consumption, as also Christian talked about earlier in the week. Consequently, the social dimensions are hidden behind the individualized interface, and this hiding of infrastructure and its effects is happening both in relation to the user's data and the infrastructure of the platform. So it becomes simultaneously technical, political, and ecological. Platformization thus includes environmental and climate effects, consumption of energy, pollution of carbon, and other waste products. Data pollution of social, cultural environments, and carbon pollution, consequently, should be seen as 2 parallel waste products of extractive capitalism and platform capitalism. So with this meme picture in mind that you see here, one might ask whether current platform design building from Google minimalism doesn't ultimately annihilate the user as an active, perceiving, reading, and critically interpreting character, and instead leaves us with a zombie character or a statistical figure, as what Olga Goyanova also later in this week talked about as ideal or digital subject. And with this, I'm also, to be quick, sort of to talk about 3 artworks that conceptualize this. And the first one is by Joanna Mull, who's based here in Barcelona. And in several of her works, she's focused on how platforms pollute and produce waste in the form of both data and greenhouse gases in several, she's done that in several artworks. So perhaps starting with her work CO2DLE, her work points to the carbon pollution from google.com, which remains hidden from the user by simply, and the work simply is showing a number which is growing as long as the user stays on google.com. And this work is called The Hidden Life of the Amazon User. It explores how the tracking and profiling of users is a big part of this. In this project, Hidden Life of the Amazon User, she maps out how her buying of a small trivial book with copied assortments of Jeff Bezos' shallow cliches about how big he is and famous and rich forces her to go through 12 different interfaces and actually download 87.33 megabytes of data that includes 1,307 different requests to scripts in Amazon's cloud. And if printed out, as you see it here in the image, it's 8,724 pages of script, and you see the small book in front of it. So consequently, buying the shallow book starts a process heavy on data that needs transmitting and computing. At the time of writing, she's continuing her work on carbon pollution of the hidden cookies of AdTech with the project Carbolytics, and she's also worked with Santa Monica, where the Santa Monica Art Center, I believe it was before Christmas. So maybe if you're local, you've seen this. Yeah, so that's one piece. Another piece that sort of aims at a different register is this Solar Protocol. It's a solar-powered website aiming to do the opposite of what Joanna Mull criticizes Amazon for. The artists and activists behind the project, Take a Brain, Alex Nathanson, and Benedetta Piantella, they work with limiting the size of web pages, avoiding cookies, etc., to establish a global network of solar-powered servers in Australia, Africa, and the Americas. And the website, solarprotocol.net, as you see here, in other words, is delivered by the server which is receiving most sunlight at the moment. This means that the website may change through the day, since it's not fully identical across the different servers, and the servers can generate both high and low resolution versions of the website, depending on the power of the battery. Furthermore, the left frame of the website informs the user about which server is currently running, including information on location and energy levels. In their manifesto, the artists argue for natural rather than artificial intelligence as a guiding principle rooting, and I'm quoting, internet traffic according to the logic of the sun, and calling for new forms of cultural production that embody a politics of accountability rather than a capitalist logic that export costs to someone else somewhere else, and I'm quoting, as cloud computing is doing, through increasing energy requiring data-driven intelligence, as we saw with Amazon. And well, since we are in Barcelona, it's also been mentioned that they also built and refer to the Low-Tech magazine that's running on a solar server here in Barcelona. And then the last piece, the final example, is a work from my hometown, Aarhus, called Aarhus Urban Operating System. It's an alternative urban platform that investigates and replaces the physical restructuring of neighborhoods in different cities, and several times in Aarhus, but he's also traveled with it. So rather than creating the political urban planning, a utopian view of the city's transition, he uses machine learning to register and perform with data the transition as experienced by the inhabitants. So data includes local maps, urban plans, sounds, and images. And so in this way, Anders Wistig constructs a critical and reflective platform which allows for different kinds of perception than the sort of platform zombies of commercial online services and apps, which I started with outlining, which also, and this piece also allows for a different way of engagement with data than the sort of clickbait. The Aarhus Urban Operating System is, among other things, performed as an instrument in a concert, and that's what you see on the image, rather than the interfacial phantasmagoria of cloud computing meta interfaces. It includes and renders visible both the technical and software-based infrastructure and how it is related to changes in the physical environment. and of course it also you also sort of get the language. It remixes the language of urban planning. It invites the user into the process and let them play with it, rather than just being reduced to individual consumer models and profiling. As such, these works can serve as countermodels to current platform perception, countermodels that are important and necessary to both fight carbon and data pollution. And in this sense, I think they show a different way of using both AI, machine learning, and internet services than the one we currently see. Yeah, so that was my part.
Thanks, Søren. Can I switch over?
Sure. Now the kids come. Yeah.
All right. Okay, thank you again everyone for joining. Before I get into the details, I'll just make a quick mention of this book, The Digital Imaginary, which is just out with Bloomsbury. And the Digital Imaginary, Literature and Cinema of the Database, addresses some issues I'm going to talk about, which is working with algorithms, with code, to disrupt, transform, and reinvent the images we make and the stories we tell. The book and the talk I'm going to give, or the introduction to some works I'm going to give, look at code as a means to take some of the creative process outside of ourselves to see our point of connection to the machine. I'm very interested myself in a concept that Walter Benjamin called innovation, very related to his concept of the optical unconscious, as film and now new media offering a point of view upon this machine that has also taken over our lives. And it's that point of contact. How do we address or discover that point of contact in some new way that might perhaps also empower us? Okay, so much for the book. The book, by the way, includes my interviews with about a dozen makers, but also lots of meta-commentaries. And as a process of writing, I try to bring back to the book the same process I bring to art, which is infusing different perspectives that clash, crash, disrupt, transform how we write, and to bring that to essay form as well as to creative narrative and poetics. I hope some of you had a chance to visit the project It Will Happen Here, which is in the Art Santa Monica on the top floor. If you haven't, it's up till August, and I'll be talking mostly about that project today. In this case, the one in Art Santa Monica is called It Will Happen Here in Barcelona, because it's a database film, and every city we show it in includes images, language, and scientific data from that location. In this case, it includes the data of animals going extinct in along the Costa Brava due to climate change and petrochemical pollution. I'll start by giving you a little bit of a sample of this video. It's a large installation. So It Will Happen Here is a project driven by algorithms to address a plethora of research and creative methods. The algorithms help break up, reorganize, and reconfront the materials we gathered. So what is the process? The project begins on one part as a collaborative work. I go out and collect research data, kayaking shorelines, walking shorelines in heavily industrialized areas in the Americas, in Europe. I use maps to gather data on climate change and sea level rise, following predicted sea level rise heights across petrochemical industries, and asking how flows will carry those contaminants into other landscapes. I see the world through cameras, underwater cameras, shooting with cameras going underwater through all of these river areas, looking at infrastructure. Geographic data and especially infrastructural geographic data on underground waterways, underground pipe systems, and what my plumbing friends call essentially the UFOs. All of this abandoned pipeware, tanks, and materials from the industrial age. Myself, I work with images that are combined. I make very small elements and use the computer to disrupt and combine these on themes, sorted not by what fits in a linear structure, but by what keywords, concepts can crash the images together and hopefully open our eyes to them, to break open the images, and to layer them by pulling out extra material to focus their attention this way and then that by how the images layer. I work with a composer, Adam Vidixis, who uses generative code, sound recordings from water sites, and then voice that attempts to articulate the process of naming. What do we see when we look out in the world? How do we find a name to describe the unspeakable? That is, the destruction of the planet as we know it through the conditions of climate change. And I work with the poet, Nick Mumford, who uses generative writing, drawing my language, and having the machine reformulate it so I confront my own language again to ask the same question: how do we name the unspeakable? Then into that language comes contamination. All of the names of all the chemicals found in these petrochemical sites, abandoned sites, muds of the Industrial Revolution. In my research, just in the Philadelphia Valley, there were over 300 sites of deep petrochemical waste and contamination within the flood zones, and thousands of different kinds of chemicals. These contaminate the text, breaking the text apart. And then there's a list of local extinctions, all the animals that will die or are dying in the process. And each of those is tailored to each place. But the machine also breaks up the user experience. And I look for different models to do that. We have, on the one hand, approaches that are immersive screen experiences, large scale, to overwhelm you, like the experience at Santa Monica. Then there are cell phone experiences, mapping the images by place, so you can go on your own walking or kayak tour of the Anthropocene. A kind of guide to a chemical wasteland. There are installations that you trigger images and create symphonies with your cell phones, coming together, everyone creating sound from the music of the phone that is triggered in relation to the images. There are kayaking tours, installation experiences, and then live performance. And in the live performance, musicians and vocalists have to respond to something that's algorithmic. It's always changing. It's never the same story twice. And that's the other aspect then, is the quality of time. How the the algorithmic system is used to disrupt the temporal structure that we expect. We don't know when things will break apart and how they will break apart. And we have to address this sense of time where the world is always shifting. No future is pre-written. There's always hope that things will work out well, although most of the time they don't. And the algorithms create this tension, always the possibility of a different future in the set of materials, the possibility of narrative like the tides. The film, the experience like the tides is always changing, and yet the threat of the water is always rising. Lastly, there is a VR version that we also put on location, which carries the 360 experience of the story, and then a participatory version. It responds as you're acting. So this is one step of a process that I'm now continuing to work on this in the North Sea as well. And thank you for your time. Anna.
May I get a card?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rod. That was fascinating as your artwork is. So I'll just start my presentation.
So, good.
Yes.
The only people who can't see is us.
So I slightly changed the title for my presentation today, and this work has been generated at the confluence of two threads. My participation in Victoria Vesna's Noise Aquarium, especially Noise Aquarium online notation, with artists and scientists, including Yolanda Harris or Martin Fresh, sitting here in the audience, on one side, and on the other side, my ongoing work with tracing genealogies of digital art, especially electronic literature, to some forms of indigenous culture. And here I'm specifically referring to an article I published on some connections or some commonalities between Sami, traditional Sami forms such as yoik, and digital literature or digital writing. So this is ongoing working process, so to speak. And I would like to start with explaining some terms, because as a researcher, I work mostly with concepts. In his essay, Contemporary Posterity, a helpful oxymoron published in EBR Electronic Book Review, Malte Starnin-Erslev insightfully analyzes the state of contemporary posterity. In his opinion, troubling the lingering periodization that the prefix implies. Troubling as it is to any linear concept of successive cultural processes, the post of the post-digitality, however, points out to a set of very complex processes in their own regard. To me, two such processes seem to be especially important. One is the way the post-digital reconfigures the very materiality of juxtaposition of the analog, physical, and the digital, computable. And the second process is incorporating time as a crucial operator and programmable element. And I leave the second element completely aside today. So the point of interest here is specifically what David Berry calls the post-digital constellation, as both an aesthetic and a logic that informs the representation of space and time within an epoch that is after digital, but which remains profoundly computational. As much as the discussion of the post-digital condition and post-digitality has been robustly carried out over the last 2 decades, there is also a concurrent stream of reflection developed from the other side of the spectrum, so to speak. Such a gesture has been described by John Durham Peters as following. The old idea that media are environments can be flipped. environments are also media. He proposes that the ontological shift resulting in seeing media as first and foremost our infrastructures of being, the habitats and materials through which we act and are, follows Friedrich Kittler's footprints, for whom media were ontological shifters. And this is the broader perspective I will be moving around today. Tracing the very concept of medium to Aristotle and his periekon, understood as surrounding on environment, Peters investigates the genealogy of the term through Latin medius and binding two terms that are also of primary importance for this endeavor, medium and milieu, both related to the notion of in-betweenness. And what I actually understand by post-digital constellation, it is as simple as that, meaning that digital data has been saturating environments, including outside of urban spaces. And increasingly we see sensing technologies and data being inserted in forests, agriculture, all kinds of spaces outside the urban. As early as in 2000, Patricia Tichinetto-Clough pointed out to the fact that the development of teletechnology brings up the increased interest in agencies other than human. The point that since 2000 has been aptly demonstrated with increased prominence of perspectives, further decentering the boundaries of subject and object, or even altogether abolishing the subject-object polarity. Be it the flat ontology or object-oriented ontology, feminist new materialism, or the critique of Anthropocene. From this perspective, the post-digital condition could be seen as the full realization of teletechnology, enabled by ubiquitous procedures of computing technology, aptly named by Jennifer Gabris as becoming environmental. Interestingly, that was also a year when Pinchas Kohn famously coined the term of post-digital. He primarily referred to the aesthetics of digital composing based on various instances of failures that inevitably haunted composers working with digital technology. So I see it as a particularly interesting confluence here. But what I'm primarily interested in today is finding different genealogies and different theoretical frameworks of becoming environmental, prompted by sensing technologies. And I'm especially interested in looking for such genealogies from the decolonial and or anti-colonial perspective. And of course, decolonizing digital culture is not a new phenomenon, as demonstrated by intervention of John Corbett, for example. Here you can see his work. John Corbett is an artist, programmer of Metis heritage, who has taken on the challenge of adapting and expressing elements of his cultural heritage and indigenous Cree language in computer code. Exploring what he and others have called indigenous programming practices, Corbett has been developing software in two particular tracks of interest, representing Metis cultural practices in code and creating a Cree programming language. Here is another initiative, and that's where the notion of indigenous programming was discussed and developed at length. I could also refer to Auti Karina Laiti thesis on ethnoprogramming, when the National Board of Education in Finland informed in 2014 that programming is going to be a part of the curriculum reform, the idea of supporting Northern Sami language in programming was born. This is what Laiti herself has written. She shows how programming's hardware and software levels rest on a terminology level, which itself rests on a cultural level. And people who are excluded from the cultural level may find may find the other levels more challenging and be discouraged from programming. Alternately, they may be forced to embrace an English-based programming language, thus reinforcing a colonial language's dominance locally. As Leite says, if we want to see a new generation of computer programmers who blur the borders of language, gender, and culture, the ethnic side of computing needs to be researched and discussed. And of course, I'm well aware that indigenous is also a contested category, and it's not quite straightforward, so I'm using it here just for the sake of some kind of clarity. Of course, there are some more popular uses of the so-called smart technologies in indigenous contexts, such as Inuktitut application monitoring eyes. And of course, this initiative sort of brings up we can be reminded of Arctic Perspective Initiative by Marco Pelhan and Matthew Biederman from, I think, around 2010. So this is the framework where I would be looking for those different frameworks, different theoretical frameworks to research the genealogies of post-digital constellation, especially for sensing technologies and for fusing the digital with the physical. And as Max Liboiron writes in his book aptly titled Pollution is Colonialism, science always happens within land relations. And those relations are always specific to that place, even if you don't believe in land. So what it looks like, I mean, to describe post-digital constellation in indigenous terms, here I just, I'm referring to the concept by Vanessa Watts, Metis anthropologist from Canada, who coined a very interesting concept of place thought grounded in indigenous cosmologies. And here is kind of a representation of her ideas. And the above figure is not intended to be a universal model of how all indigenous peoples think, believe, etc. Rather, it is simply a depiction of the crucial differences between indigenous and Euro-Western processes. The visual on the left describes the animate nature of land. To be animate goes beyond being alive or acting. It is to be full of thought, desire, contemplation, and will. Human thought and action are therefore derived from a literal expression of particular places and historical events in Anishinaabe cosmologies. The agency that place possesses can be thought of in a similar way that Western thinkers locate agency in human beings. It follows that if, as indigenous peoples, writes Watts, we are extensions of the very land we walk out on. And as she elaborates, we have an obligation to maintain communication with it. So the notion of communicating with environment has not been new at all. And so those indigenous frameworks provide, I think, kind of a shift of a perspective where alternative ontologies that were just recently sort of elaborated upon in Western thought have always been here with us. And we could also, I mean, employing those perspectives can significantly shift how we think digital technologies in general. For example, Western fixation on privacy, so prevalent in the discussion on digital media today, could be seen as imbued with a sense of moral panic around the idea of autonomous individual subject losing its boundaries and becoming more open to others and the environment. Of course, granted that the condition of digital capitalism are accounted for, but still, there is a sense of moral panic around this highly heated discussion on rights to your privacy, meaning usually rights to being just individual, autonomous me, myself. And of course, I could. I know. So yeah, it is meant as a, I think, proposition for discussion. Thank you, Professor.
The topic I want to talk about actually is the first step towards the new project, research and curatorial at the same time, because since 2010 I've been running a project I initiated in the Center for Contemporary Art in Gdańsk in Poland, Art plus Science meeting, where I try to analyze different transdisciplinary connections between art and other disciplinary. The last two projects was about non-anthropocentric ecology and transdisciplinarity with participation of a group of artists. One of them, Jill Scott, is actually sitting here. And reflection on these interactions between trans-anthropocentric perspective and transdisciplinarity brought me to the concept of holobiont, which I imagine could be the common ground for all these issues developed in both territories. And it will come in some time, probably in a book, in the form of book and exhibition. But at the moment, this is just some sketches, some ideas, some quotations, some references, building the field for this research. So, as I said, the holobiont is the basic notion for this approach. But obviously, we have to start with co-evolution as the basic process for which holobiont perspective becomes necessary to grasp all activities developing in this field. The concept of holobiont is usually connected with Lynn Margulis, but some researchers reminded us that actually the researcher who coined it was Adolf Meyer Abich, more than 40 years before. And I think that in the field of humanities, social sciences, we began to talk more about this because of Bruno Latour, who introduced this discourse into several of his publications. Also, it was a very important theoretical part for exhibition he curated with Peter Weiner for the ZKM critical zones. What I wanted to bring to your attention is, however, some other developments in the field, especially some ideas coming from Ward Charlson, and the proposition to distinguish between different kinds of mutualism. One, which is initial association between the symbiote and the host, and secondary, where we see the incorporation of the primary mutualism into the secondary host. And what I want to stress, following Ward Charlson, in such a situation, the primary host either becomes the symbiont or is lost. I will come back in a while to this observation. And also to remind that in a holobiont comprising the host and all its symbionts population, success of the holobiont depends on the success of parties involved in the intersections. So when we are talking nowadays about climate crisis, global warming, massive extinctions, it will bring to our attention the fact that the success of parties involved is becoming almost unavailable. Another important statement I'd like to refer is the proposal to shift attention from the thinking what kind of individuals are holograms to what kind of processes make holograms. Because this shift proposes us to think about holograms in very different scales, referring to very different groups of very different organisms. So in such a situation, we should not think only about human as a hologram, like community comprising human beings and different forms of microorganisms like viruses, bacteria, fungi. But we should think about human as playing also different role in this. And this is again that we need to invite to this field the concept of James Radloff, proposing Gaia as the biggest in our world, in the perspective of our world, community of living beings, where actually Gaia becomes hologram. So we are talking now in different scale, and humans play different roles in this system. Once this is just one small host offering possibility of interaction, even smaller symptoms. On the other hand, human become just one of the symptoms hosted by Gaia. And again, now we see why this distinction between primary and secondary individualism is so important for such a situation. Because humans taking the role of symbionts towards Gaia is in the same time so powerful in his capabilities that becomes also another host. And we have such a situation when Gaia as a host must be removed from its position and human in relationship to host, to Gaia, to Earth, becomes playing the role of the host. Mm-hmm. And just again, if such a situation happens, the primary host either becomes the sentient or is lost. Gaia can't become a symbiont towards the human in spite of the fact that the human trying to play such a role. So if the situation will develop the track, and like it was traveling this until now, that means that the primary symbol is lost. Gaia, Earth, is getting to lose, to become cemetery of previous life. So this is the theoretical concept I want to fill with different references to different artworks. For me, very important for such a researcher is that artistic discourses. In that moment, I'd like to say that my perspective has to develop in a fragmented way. So we can't just try to create a system which is very clearly structured, organized with some dominating points and ideas where we are going to, which field we should actually land this is only perspective built up of fragments of different small particles which should find energy connecting them into some unpredictable whole by themselves. So the number and diversity of the outlets that are involved in the project can be the chance for this. Victoria Vesna Noise Aquarium, Anna referred already to this piece which was presented in the center in the end of 2020. It's another approach in this direction. And again, we are trying to maybe not take the similar perspective, but to involve knowledge and kind of affective relationship to the creatures beyond our perception, but building our work. As Victoria Vesna reminded, every second brief we get from those creatures. Okay, I'm coming to the end. Thank you. And the last example, the number I expected to present more examples, but time limitations made me resign from many others. But for the end, I'd like to refer to Domenico, and she made a series of works dealing with this kind of issues. What is very interesting for me in this particular is firstly the title. We are talking about Holocaust society. So actually it shows that we are coming to the point I'm talking about in a group coming from different perspectives. Secondly, that this is the part of the exhibition which I don't have to remind Barcelona residents, because it was presented here in the Center for Contemporary Culture last year. So this is this science fiction, living among companion species. That's another perspective on the same issue. There is a number of artists participating, and this is very characteristic what I said previously, that here scientists are part of the exhibition, not only artists. When you have a look at the list of the names, you see that there's also theoretical reflection involved in the exhibition itself. And actually some of the works, like the one by the Holocaust Society, this is actually the work comprising also theoretical and artistic discourses in one hall. So, yes, I know my time is over, so just reference to the exhibition itself. I think that this is a great example of working in this field. And I'm very happy that I'm in the place where this exhibition has.
Great, thanks. So we have a very limited amount of time for conversation. I hope you have enjoyed the panels. We'll be able to take a couple questions. And it's one of the things that strikes me is how also the sense of us being the hosts, trying to find the ways in which we have our symbiotic relationships with nature through the machine, is that we're at the same time hosts to the machine. And we have to address that crisis. So with that, maybe, does any of the panelists want to start off with a question? Or shall we throw it out? Questions from the audience then, please. Who wants to jump in? Yes?
I don't know if it's a question to you, Rod, or to the whole panel, but you were when you presented your book, you were referring to the sort of role of the imaginary in multi-billion. And I was thinking of the sort of kinds of imaginaries that are at play at this panel, because there's sort of the imaginary of the image, of course, and art, but also the imaginary of the pipeware that contains sort of I think a socio-technical imaginary of progress that seems to have been lost. There are the imaginaries of capital and capital's destructive forces in these things. So I'm wondering sort of how you think of the imaginary and the role of the imaginary.
Absolutely, and I think actually this is a great question for the whole panel, because I think so much of what I try to do is about the process in which different technologies but different relationships to nature are opened up. You can begin to think, to let stories unfold in different ways. The way time, to get away from, say, clock time and alarm time and punch clock time, to time as being like the oceans, time as a time of insects, how that makes you move, feel, participate in the world differently, to get away from the dominance of us being hosts to the machine. And the sense of all of these works that are so sentient and trying to see through, in a way, the eyes of animals, to change the way you look out on the world, is the way you imagine what's next, how you desire, how you long, how you fear, how you move. That the imaginaries are the ways that stories can be imagined or things might be named, how in dreams these elements unfold, how you get away from just, we have data like the climate change, so much data that fails to change the imaginaries and therefore fails to move us. So how do we put all of this information we're getting together differently, that we're actually moved to action, to out of necessity? And I think that must resonate really so much with the other works here too.
Yeah, although I must say that I'm kind of worried whenever this idea of counter is being used, because it implies kind of like binary dialectic that is so often being appropriated by capitalism. You know, you have this and not this, and there's always kind of like, you know, appropriating not this, because this is, you know, something exciting, right? So I would say I would be wary of binary dialectics, including those, you know, mapping and counter mapping, because what's counter usually comes from the margins, right? And the very idea of some phenomena being sort of relegated to this counter spaces seems to be troubling. So you know, a lot of indigenous concepts and indigenous knowledge is being sort of relegated to the new animism, which is, you know, kind of a convenient category that does not do much in terms of really troubling us, you know, as people living in this, I think, Western framework. So that's actually replied to your question, but otherwise, I think there is so much actually to talk about whenever we speak about counter-imaginaries, because of course we need them as well. So it's not like either or, again, it's both, I think.
Yeah, well, just as a question from my point of view, I think several of our, well, I guess we all kind of addressed different ways of sensing and of seeing from the sort of interface level to, well, obviously I could have talked about your work or in the same way as some of the other works, because it includes, as you also presented it, and as we've seen, a lot of different ways of sensing, of measuring, and of seeing and hearing and reading the environment, and as Anna talked about, you know, the sort of decolonial perspective also as a way of understanding things differently. And I guess I also agree with what Anna just said, that there's in a way there's no counter, because we are in this system, right? And you know, then you can talk about Gaia or you know, the sort of the interface that includes us all. There's no way out, and also if we talk about climate change, this is also a technological measured topic, right? You know, we wouldn't know exactly what hit us if we didn't measure. So the way that the measurement is also, well, also in your piece, part of the story. there's not an idealized nature we can go back to in that sense.
Yes, please. This might be the last question. Do we have
Last question. Thank you. Very interesting presentation. All of them. My question is about the role of the artist and the critic as activists in this whole future we're facing. And my question is really about how can we work together to raise an awareness, but more to create critical and more lateral thinking in our communities.
That's a hell of a question. That's a question that we've been asking for forever, I think. Both as an artist and as a researcher, and as an educator, because most of us are educators this way or another. And I would say that, part of the reason why I'm interested in radically shifting the perspectives is that we cannot go like this, go on like this. I mean, something has to be radically shifted, like now, and radically, meaning that we probably need to think about what's possible in the most, alien terms, like, for example, accounting for the spirits of the place, all those attempts at granting some of the legal agency to rivers across the world that is being often referred to, like the Suquehanna River in New Zealand and rivers in India. This is not going to be enough if we don't change the bigger perspective. And there is no easy answer to that, I think. Max Liboiron, whom I quoted in my presentation, he actually writes about that. They write about that. So they write that being an activist, being a scientist activist, this is something that I think we probably look more closely to, and it's happening with the art and science movement already. So I would say, to me, it is always a matter of doing something. Really doing something, not only, we need both sides, cultural critique and radical doing something, like shifting the relationship with students, shifting the relationship with the system we work with, and that's a lot.
I just want to add that the success of building development of SciArt, of this art and science perspective is extremely important notice. Because activists nowadays, especially in the fields we are talking about, has to be built on knowledge. Knowledge developed different ways, not only framed by university. They have some gravity towards traditional way of defining knowledge and defining the ways we are building it. But collaboration between artists and scientists and critical perspective taken by both sides transform the field is critical art science, which is the only choice and the only chance.
That's right. The process needs to go out to the communities in different ways. It transforms. I think we see this with ISEA, taking artworks out all over, trying to take it to different places and building these kind of collaborations we've talked a lot about over the last few days. That the process has to be multimodal and fractured. The top-down approach that comes from dominant media does not change the logic of the media that creates it. And we can't get out of the structure that comes from a 19th century industrial logic, which endures today, from a simple top-down approach. It has to be fragmented, multimodal, multidisciplinary, in fact breaking down in a way these borders and getting also out of the universities to other environments. We are out of time. I want to thank everyone for coming, and I hope the conversations keep going on.